Hello, Liz. How you doing this morning?
Good, good. How are you?
I know I always say this morning, and it's not morning, but how are you doing? Is it early afternoon, would you consider it, or?
It's 11 a.m., so I'm already in a headspace of thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch while you're
See,
figuring out coffee or tea.
yeah, no, it's funny because literally, like, after this, I'm going to get green tea. So I'm like, we're in different places. I feel so good about last night's live stream.
Me
Did
too,
you feel good?
because I don't really do live streams like, late at night and then I'm like wired and I don't know if you felt it, but I really liked it. And so I was kind of like invigorated after and then, I don't slow down as much, but I thought it was really great. And I love getting to hear from advocates about personal experiences with ERP, kind of what we think about it, and just starting to like debunk all these myths and negative perceptions and attitudes that have started to kind of become in our space about ERP. And really it's just such an incredible treatment.
Yeah, I think what it is like all of us in the industry as clinicians, as mental health providers, are doing everything we can to continue to figure out ways to make treatment more accessible, to make treatment more impactful and more effective. And I think one of the big things, we proposed a talk that I hope will be picked, but I think one of those things is there was a really good blog article by John Hirschfield, and just talking about the way that ERP advanced. It's when I learned about it and studied it in grad school, that was what I chose to do my thesis on. I remember reading the 1968 first introductory to it, the 70s, the 80s, when it really started to pick up. And I'm like, oh, we've advanced. This isn't a very old school methodology. There's a lot more cognitive components, a lot more values-based components. And I think just seeing people get better from it every day as a clinician, as well as my own experience. I actually spoke at an event for OCD therapists with OCD in Los Angeles, and just hearing everybody kind of in the Q&A and share and just like how the treatments worked for them. So I love that the field is advancing. We're always coming up with new strategies, but I think the biggest thing I hope it debunked last night is that we're not dragging you around public streets having you licking things. Like, that's not what it is. Or if you're a Christian and you're doing treatment for scrupulosity, we're not having you burn Bibles. Like, it's not a fear factor. We're not trying to evoke as much terror in you as possible. So definitely making sure that people kind of realize.
One of the things I really liked, I don't know if you thought so too, Chris, is that I liked that Ethan talked about kind of the extreme nature of his ERP and how Katya would kind of push him to these different degrees. And the reason I liked it is because I liked that Ethan talked a lot about how that worked for him. And I think what it is that it's just, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is that ERP looks different for every person. And so sometimes some of us, like, we want to go do like these, like, let's go eat on the floor and let's go do these more extreme things. And sometimes we need to, and that works for you. And that's great. And for some of us, like, we don't need to go there and it's different and it's values based and that's great. Right. And I think that I like that what I felt like we heard last night that I just want people to hear is that ERP should not be standard for every person. It should be individualized and it should be based on your own values and motives. Right. So it's kind of like, I remember telling one of my patients once, and when she was like, my mom wants me to pick up my clothes, and like, I don't see why it's a big deal if they're on my floor, right? And I kind of said to her, I was like, so tell me why you don't want to do that. And she's like, because it doesn't matter to me. I don't find the value in it. And I remember we sat back and and obviously this isn't an OCD thing, but we sat back and we were talking about, okay, well, how could we make this values based? And what she then started to talk about is like, oh, like, I'm going to college next year, and like, I'm going to have roommates, and I want to be kind of like a clean person, but I also don't want them to get frustrated with me. And so all of a sudden she started picking up her clothes, and it wasn't because the task changed, but it was because for her, the value in the behavior made sense now because it was values based. It was like, okay, I'll do this thing that I might still find annoying. I might still not want to do it, but I'll do it because there's a value now. And so now it's worth it because I see the value in it. And the point is exactly what you're saying, Matt. It's like the mindset and the value has to be seen. So if some clinician is just having you do these random exposures, but you don't see the value in them or they don't make sense, there's no way you're going to want to do it. And there's certainly no way you're going to want to maintain ERP. And I think we talked about this, Chris, with Jeff Szymanski, where Chris was saying, one time, like I had a patient with scrupulosity, and next thing you knew, exposures were like throwing rocks at a church. And it was like, well, wait a second, is that something they think is important? Or is it just like, oh, like someone thought it made sense that like, oh, well, if you have scrupulosity, let's just go do that because that's something you would need to do for an exposure. And it was like, no way, like that's not values-based, that's not needed. And again, does it really make sense? Like our exposure should make sense for us. We should understand why we're doing them, and we should be willing to do them. We might still be hesitant to do them. We might still not want to do them, and we need Chris or someone to motivate us, right? But they should make sense. Like we should be able to say, I totally know why I'm doing this and why this is something that I need to be doing for my future.
Yeah, no, I thought about it the other day. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I was going down. So I live in an apartment complex, and obviously I have trash cans in my own apartment. But then you have like a big dumpster in your area that you throw everything in. And I was holding this really nice black shirt that I have, this button-up black shirt that I needed to take to dry cleaning. And in the other hand, I had my recycle. And I was like not really thinking. It was early in the morning, and I throw my shirt into the dumpster instead of my recycling or my trash bag. And I was like, no. So I had to like reach in, grab my shirt, throw the trash in the right thing, kind of put it in a ball because it was a little wet with something. And then I took it to the dry cleaners. But I was thinking like, if this would have been before treatment, I would have just let that shirt lay there and just been trashed. And so I know sometimes people are saying like, oh, ERP is having you dive in dumpsters. I mean, that doesn't necessarily need to be it. What I do let clients know is there's going to be situations in your life where something happens like what happened to me. And you want to be able to be in that mindset of like, okay, this isn't ideal. I don't love reaching in for my shirt, but am I really just going to let this shirt and just be trashed simply because it makes me feel uncomfortable? The other thing I was thinking about as well is one of my big fears was lotion. I had a doctor once who was telling me to put lotion on my hands because my hands were so cut up from all the washing. And the doctor said, make sure you look at the expiration date on the lotion, because I had a client once, or a patient once, who used old lotion and it got their finger infected and they actually had to get their finger cut off. So of course, because my OCD was around health anxiety, I'm thinking lotion equals losing your finger. So I avoided lotion. I wouldn't like hug people that used lotion. I wouldn't go down aisles in the grocery store that had lotion. And going back to kind of extreme ERP, it may not feel extreme to others, but my therapist and I had me lather up and put lotion all over like my arms and my legs and my, my face and everything. But I think about it all the time because there's a mall that I take a lot of clients to, and we kind of just do exposures and walk around, but they have like these big Bath and Body and all these lotiony places. And it's like, every time we go by, I'm like, ooh, I want to smell pretty. And I'll put some on. And I'm like, once again, all those years ago, my old self would be like, you're going to lose your fingers. So it's just cool, like as you're in recovery, to see these different things where so many years ago it would have been hard, but now you're able to just do normal things and it feels so glorious.
Oh, and I know how many people are watching this live stream right now that are looking for an expiration date on their lotion.
Well, most of them don't even have it.
Talking about, but you're right? It's for me, it's like, even if there was an expiration date that had expired, I'd be like, guys, together, who knows what's gonna, if your next live stream you see me without a finger. But I love it, Chris, right? And that's what we're talking about, is that at the end of the day, we not only face our fears, but there's so much pride. And for I always tell people that the one thing OCD taught me that I appreciate is to not take any little thing for granted. I am so proud of myself in the morning that I can shower in 5 minutes, or some days if I don't have time to shower, I might not shower, and I shower at night, and that's fine, and I'm not worried about it. And that's just kind of how it goes some days with 2 kids and life. But that, for me, for many people, right, you don't think twice about that, where to be able to sit back and be like, oh my gosh, I got to pick whatever clothes I wanted out of my closet, and I can grab my shoes without having to wash my hands. Those little things, it's you get excited in being able to do everyday tasks, because we all know that untreated OCD impacts it all, right? And so again, I think the big piece with ERP is, and Chris and I've been talking about this, and I think last night just really confirmed it. It should feel right to you. I'm not saying it's going to feel easy. It should feel difficult, right? But it should feel right to you, right? It should be values based. It should help get you closer to what you want to be doing. It should feel right to you. And if when you're doing ERP, you're like, I'm doing this because Chris told me to, but like this doesn't make any sense and I don't know why I'm doing it and I don't see the value in this, you should be talking to your clinician about that. Because at the end of the day, Chris talks a lot about this. This isn't fear factor. We're not doing this just to see how uncomfortable we can make you. We should be doing it because there's a greater good goal and there's a bigger picture that we're fighting towards.
Really well said.
So,
Quick announcements, but
we went on a derail.
yeah, and if you, I was going to say, if you didn't catch last night, so Ethan hosted, we had Liz, myself, as well as another lead advocate, Katie O'Dunn. If you missed it, the great thing is all of our live streams you can access them on Facebook. I think a lot of people don't know that. In Facebook, if you go up to videos on the IOCDF page, you can see them if you prefer Facebook. If you'd rather go to YouTube, you just go to youtube.com/IOCDF. You can click on all the live streams. And so we did one on ERP 101. And I think it's really good, even if you've had ERP, to watch, because we talk about just how flexible it is, and you might kind of click with some of the things. As always, this live stream is about you. So we already have some. Please feel free to comment throughout the live stream, support each other, ask questions. Liz and I are both licensed clinicians in our respective states, Texas and California, but we also have lived experience with OCD. And so we would love to answer your questions, give you any support, any direction. Always remember, though, we obviously can't be your clinician on this live. So if you want to find a clinician, you can head over to iocdf.org/IOCDF and then, /find-help. So that's iocdf.org/find-help. Remember also that if you're in crisis, we obviously can't support you from this live stream and you might need more support. If you do, please go to a local emergency room, call 911 or dial 988 or go to 988lifeline.org for the suicide and crisis hotline. And then lastly, please be respectful to everyone and remember this is being recorded. So Liz, I'm going to ask you the first question, and also we have some pre-submitted that we have as well, so we'll go back and forth. But we have Lucas at, I always have to do the time change, at 12:09 for you, Amanda. I suffer by intrusive commands. How do I heal from that since ERP requires me to do what I'm afraid of? But these commands demand things that I should absolutely not do. Example, jump in front of a train.
Yeah, so I definitely want you to be talking to your provider about your intrusive thoughts and what's going on. OCD might give us intrusive thoughts like that would be an image or a thought of jumping in front of a train, but it wouldn't be a command like you need to go do that. And so if you're having auditory commands, like you're hearing something or you're being told to do something, you really want to talk to your clinician about that to differentiate what may or may not be OCD. Again, if OCD is giving us an intrusive thought, like what if we harm our child? What if we jump in front of a train? What if I veer my car off the side of the road? And that's triggering to us and we're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that. Why is it telling me it? The exposure is not going and doing that harmful thing. The exposure is actually choosing to just acknowledge the thought and not listen to it and still do the activity you were doing. So for example, if you are on the train track and you're waiting for your train to go to wherever you're going and you're triggered, right? You have this thought of I should jump in front of the train. The exposure is to sit there, not jump in front of the train, be like, oh, it's a weird thought, and still wait for the train and then get on the train. If you're, have an intrusive thought about your child, the trigger is the intrusive thought. The compulsion might be to either engage in checking behaviors, make sure your child's safe, or to avoid spending time or being with your kids. So the ERP is to spend time to acknowledge that thought of like, oh, there's that thought, I may not like it, or who knows what that means, and choosing not to solve it. Right. So ERP is us choosing to continue to engage in activities that might bring on triggers and to not engage in rituals. ERP is not us actually having our fears or triggers come true.
Yeah, Lucas, I think sometimes too, and that's why we were talking about doing a ERP part 2 from last night. I think sometimes it's understanding really what ERP is asking you to do. So I think there's a little confusion in the treatment. So we have some of those impulsive, intrusive thoughts, like I should push a kid in the middle of the street. I should jump in front of a train. A lot of people will be standing on a balcony, right? And they're like, I should just jump. ERP is not requiring you to do what OCD says. In fact, what we're asking you to do is to not engage in what OCD says, to not treat OCD's messaging as something of value. So, for instance, if I'm standing, I didn't really have the intrusive thoughts of like me doing something harmful, but I had ones like being in the store, being behind someone, and OCD was like grab their neck and like hit them or bash their head into something. my treatment was not asking me to actually do that thing. What instead it was recognizing is like, I'm going to have these kind of impulsive, kind of intrusive messaging like you're getting. The OCD wants me to then fixate on it. Why is this coming? Does this really mean that I want to jump in front of a train? Would I jump in a train? And now, as we're kind of getting that like feeling unsure, feeling very doubtful, the mistake we make is we do mental compulsions and physical ones. So maybe you would not going to take the train anymore and get to work a different way. Or maybe you're going to spend the next hour in your head, like, why did I have that thought, etc. You're taking too much of an active approach, and that activity, that conflict is what keeps us in our fight or flight and makes us treat this like a real emergency. If instead we kind of acknowledge like, there's that OCD voice again, doing what it always does. Well, I'm shooken up. I don't like the way that I feel, but I'm going to choose to disengage. Somebody said it last night. I think it was Katie. It's like walking out of the courtroom. It's like I'm going to choose to walk out of the courtroom and not try to make meaning of my thoughts. Remember, we can't control these intrusive thoughts, but we can change our relationship, and your relationship needs to be not engaging in them. So don't think treatment is having you jump in front of a train. It's actually quite the opposite. It's not engaging with that messaging.
That's right. We have so many good comments from yesterday. Thank y'all. Y'all are so sweet. Dr. Areola said at 12:01 your time, Amanda. Yes, McLean does work with patients. So I think this is a good question. I just want to talk about for a second is that I think when a lot of people hear that the Houston OCDI is self-pay or a private pay clinic, people think that means, oh my gosh, I can't use insurance and I have to be able to pay the entire bill on my own. And that's not the case at all. So what I mean by that is I think our last number showed that like 82% of our patients use our insurance. Use their insurance, not my insurance. And so what happens with this is we help you navigate the insurance process. So we may help you, get an in-network exemption, or you may be able to get even a single case agreement where the insurance company would pay up front for you to be able to come. So there are a lot of options to still use insurance. And then we, of course, do offer scholarships and sliding scale and different coverage as feasible. So definitely consider giving us a call. But think about that across the board, you guys, is that I think a lot of times we think, oh, I want to go see Chris for I'm just making this up, Chris, but I want to go see Chris for outpatient, but he's self-pay and it's individual sessions. You can still file for reimbursement with your insurance. So even if Chris sees you and you pay him cash, you would ask for what's called a super bill and you would file for reimbursement. And this is a talk we're planning to do with Fred Penzel, and I think it was pushed to March, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going to talk about nabbing insurance, accessing care, what that looks like and how to do it and how to navigate it. Because it's really important that I don't want us to think, oh, self-pay means I can't use insurance at all and there's no way I can foot that bill on my own. That's not what it means. It does mean that you may not be insurance may not always be paying us directly, or that we're not in network, but there are still options to utilize your insurance.
Yeah, and like where I work, we do take some insurance. So I think it's just reaching out to different places for sure. Oh. I like this. This one's more a comment, but I'll ask you, Liz. Matt B at 1204 says, I know the mindset of ERP doesn't mean you just have to function with feeling the triggers of full fear. It's learning that you can do ERP in an enjoyable way and your confidence grows. Can you talk about, for you personally, two parts? One, how you kind of got into that mindset of sort of like embracing fear in the sense of like, this fear is basically just telling me not to do the things I love. I want to engage in things like being a mom and living on my own. And then talk about like the lessons and the confidence in yourself that grew from it. Because I think sometimes people mishear the term like live in uncertainty means you're going to doubt things for life. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I gained a lot of trust in myself through the ERP process.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. That, I think that a lot of times, we talked about this last night, we do think that like, oh, ERP means I just have to like keep facing my triggers forever. Eventually, you guys, ERP should mean that triggers never become triggers. So thoughts stay thoughts. So what I mean by that is that you should have thoughts. Everyone has thoughts, weird thoughts, good thoughts, awkward thoughts, strange thoughts. Like that's normal. But the difference is, when do they become a trigger? And if we're doing ERP appropriately, thoughts shouldn't transition to triggers. They should stay thoughts. And that's the goal. And what I will say is that's why we want to start ERP slowly and systematically, right? With Chris's fears that he's talked about, his fears of, Chris, you've talked a little bit about some of your fears around like pesticides or things like that.
Yeah, chemicals, yeah.
When things are like fumigated and they do the tinting of the houses, we wouldn't start by having Chris walk by a tenant house eating his lunch, right? But we're going to slowly work our way up to that. And the reason we do that is we want you to have success along the way. We don't want to start with what's called flooding, where like we push you into an exposure that you're not ready for, you're not willing to do, and you end up ritualizing, because that's going to actually decrease your confidence. It's going to make you think you can't do this. ERP is too overwhelming. We want you to work up to it. With that being said, I always caveat that with the fact that when you get to your highest level exposures, it is supposed to be hard. Any exposure is supposed to be hard and triggering, but we should feel able to face them, right? So I always use the terminology of like challenging but obtainable. Like it should be hard, but we should have the confidence that we can do it.
Yeah, and what I'll just say quickly about trusting yourself, I never felt going through the treatment that my life goal was I was just going to have to be uncertain all the time or confused or lost. What I did is while I was doing the treatment, I learned a lot about myself. I could face my fears. All the things that OCD was saying never came true and it was lying, that I have the ability to do the things that I love and be good at it. So for me, I gained so much confidence in myself. In fact, I think you kind of like Dr. Grayson says, is like you almost kind of gain a little bit extra. And so I think for me, for instance, like when the pandemic hit, I handled it a little bit better than my friends and family that don't even have OCD, because that acceptance piece, that letting go, that I think is such a core part of the treatment. It was like, all right, like Chris, me personally cannot stop a pandemic. So these are the adjustments that the government's making. These are the adjustments I have to make at work. Let me just jump into action versus getting stuck on the fact that it's not the way I want it to be. I'm going to ask you another good question. So at 12:11, Padmini Kumar asked, brushing teeth is not automatic for her 42-year-old son because it has to be perfect. How can he face that? So it sounds like instead of just like, automatic brushing, there's a lot of perfection in it.
Yeah, so we're going to address this with ERP, right? If this is a OCD symptom, so we want to really want to work with their provider, but the goal eventually is to be willing to brush your teeth imperfectly, to be willing to not have this like strict, rigid system and way of brushing our teeth. Of course, if this is OCD, right, there could be other reasons why there's rigidity or perfection around teeth brushing that we want to rule out. But if we're talking about OCD, we want to apply ERP across the board here, which is that we don't want to avoid brushing our teeth. We still want to brush our teeth, but we want to brush them in a non-rigid, imperfect way.
Yeah. And that's the thing as well. It's like what we're trying to do in that moment is the OCD is kind of create a set of rules to brush your teeth. And a lot of times it sounds like with your son, a lot of times the reason that he's not probably brushing his teeth or he's avoiding it is because it's exhausting to have to do kind of mundane tasks in a perfectionistic way. So it would be bringing the toothbrush to the session with his therapist or to do it on camera if it's a virtual session. And it's practicing kind of shaking the system up again. Just because OCD gave us a rule doesn't mean we have to follow it. And I like to think of OCD as kind of like the enemy, right? We're going to kind of make him uncomfortable. So it would be deliberately skipping a tooth or brushing it in an opposite way or doing it in a way that doesn't feel right. Now, obviously, he's not going to feel great after, but as therapists, we teach our clients to not let that feeling dictate behavior. Just because it doesn't feel right, it's not because it's wrong. It's because he's going and defying the OCD. But what he'll notice is every time he brushes his teeth, if he shakes it up, after a while, you've kind of broken that ritualistic component. And then it's a lot easier to just motion and do it the way you want. And then what I tell clients is you don't have to do that for life. You don't have to, for the rest of your life, brush your teeth a certain kind of crazy way. After a while, you won't care. And then you'll just come up with your routine and move on.
That's right. Next question is at 12:13 your time, Amanda. I have a problem with repeating words and phrases and making hundreds of lists. The main problem for me is that they have to rhyme. I'm constantly having to search for new rhymes. How do I do exposures for this?
You know what would be a good one for this? Terracotta, by the way, is such a cool name. We talked about last night about core fears. So with this one, it doesn't sound like there's like a deep connection. And like I said, please put in the chat if I'm incorrect. But a lot of times when there's certain things like making lists, unless the fear is you're going to forget things, that can sometimes be the core fear is if I don't make lists, I might forget something and I need to write it down. But typically with my clients that have to repeat words or repeat phrases or make lists, it's more so that if they defy it, they don't have this like this bad thing will happen. It's more of like, I need to do it or it doesn't feel right or it feels uncomfortable. So we were talking in the stream last night of kind of going deeper. Sometimes writing a narrative, imaginal script, or doing the downward arrow technique can help you get to the bottom. And so for most clients, they're just not going to feel right. It's going to be hard to concentrate. They're going to feel irritated or irritable because their brain wants them to write these lists. Or if they write it and it needs to rhyme and you don't rhyme, you're going to be triggered and then you can't focus on other things. So that core fear is that you're going to feel that way forever. The awesome thing is we can kind of test that out with exposures. So maybe you start to write a list that doesn't rhyme on purpose, or maybe you skip a few phrases or words to be repetitive. What's going to happen is you are going to feel that discomfort that OCD threatens you with. But if you just kind of be bored to it, just kind of be indifferent, what you'll notice is scientifically, we cannot sustain that level of discomfort forever, especially if we're not doing compulsion. So you'll see that discomfort fade. And then OCD's whole argument of you feeling uncomfortable forever is now kind of broken. And that core fear that it uses to freak you out doesn't feel as real anymore. And it's easier to kind of shrug off these compulsions. So unless I have your core fear wrong, please put in the chat if there's something else. But I'd work on that, because typically for people, it's that fear of feeling uncomfortable or not right forever. And they'll quickly see that that feeling can't last forever.
That's right. Next question at 12:17. I struggle with making decisions and overthinking. Do you have any advice or resources to help? And do you know any therapists who have experience with this?
I'll give a little bit and then you can answer it. One thing I tell every client, because that was my biggest thing, I would say before I really understood that I had OCD, my hardest thing was making decisions. And whatever decision I made, then all I would do is sit there and just obsess and ruminate and compulse about what my life would have been like if I made the other decision. And I'll never forget, I was actually in a Psych 100 class. This was before my OCD got real bad. And I was sitting there, and I don't remember all these years later what decision, but it's like I could not even focus in class because I was almost like replaying what my life would have looked like if I made the opposite decision. What I realized for OCD is we want to make decisions that are 100% and 0, meaning they're 100% right and 0% wrong. Rarely are we going to do that. Maybe in math, because there's usually only one answer, or if somebody's like, I can give you $100 or slap you, obviously the decision is easy. But in real life, it's not going to be like that. You might get a job to go to New York, and there's some great things about the raise and the travel and being on the East Coast, but there's going to be some negatives. You're going to leave your family and maybe you don't like the snow. So the problem with OCD is we try to make this decision that's going to be perfect and we're going to be 100% happy, and there's not. There's going to be a lot of good, and sometimes part of those decisions aren't going to be great. So the OCD is demanding perfection. It's demanding that it is right. So that's why you're sitting there and overthinking it, because you're waiting for that feeling of just pure bliss, like I made the right decision, aha. A lot of life is making decisions. They may not be the best ones, and then you adjust, or you make a decision and reflect years later, it wasn't the perfect decision. So I would look out for that, because that's going to be one of the things. But for Liz, to take it a step further, once they kind of recognize that and they make decisions, how can they work on that overthinking?
Yeah, so again, remember that I love this question, you guys, because this is not really any different than someone with OCD who's like, okay, I did the exposure, but how do I not ruminate, right? And people will talk about like, I can do the exposure, but then I'm still ruminating. It's like, well, then the exposure is not going to be useful because we're still ritualizing. So if you make a decision, but then you're spending the time after ruminating about whether it was the right decision, whether it made sense, whether you should have made a different decision, that exposure is going to feel really crappy, right? Because we like did the exposure, but now we're just trying to still feel good versus actually leaning into the exposure, right? I can't do a contamination exposure and then just say, okay, I'm going to wait and see if I get sick, or I'm going to not touch anything else to not cross-contaminate. That contamination exposure will feel brutal, and it perpetuates a cycle of OCD. Instead, we want the exposure to be that we do it, we embrace it, we allow ourselves to feel and be contaminated. And so I really want you, like we just talked about, Chris just mentioned, think about the core fear and make sure we lean into that, right? So we do the exposure, we make a decision, we order food off the menu, and automatically OCD throws at us, well, was that the right decision? What if there was a better meal? What if you could have had something different? And we automatically lean into like, who knows if this meal is going to be great or perfect, but like it's the meal I chose and I'm going to choose not to solve that or answer it. And then we start re-engaging in conversation at lunch and doing other things. So it's about us when those thoughts come up that pull us into wanting to overthink or overanalyze or ruminate. We lean into the unknown with accepting, right, kind of the current decision we made, right, that good enough, and moving forward.
Yeah, and then you start to learn that if you make a decision, it ends up not being the right one, you adjust, or that you land on your feet anyways. That's where it starts to foster that trust in yourself that, hey, every decision I make isn't going to be life changing. And all therapists that work with OCD definitely specialize in that. I mean, that's just kind of a common OCD concern that we work with. So if you go to iocdf.org/find-help, you can find a therapist and just ask them and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with. Is this something you feel comfortable working with? I can read a pre-submitted question. So if you don't know, if you go to iocdf.org/peace of mind, or if you DM probably on Instagram, the IOCDF, any questions, we can answer them as well. So sometimes people will ask pre-submitted because they can't be here live, and then they watch it back to see their question answered. So the question we got pre-submitted of many is, I suffer from contamination OCD to chemical substances. I struggle after an exposure because I feel guilty that doing that and contaminating other items that they can't wash. How do you cope with this feeling?
Right. So again, remember, we're not actually looking at or examining the way we feel as the outcome. Instead, it's about an exposure and leaning in. The way we feel will shift over time, but we actually don't want to put emphasis on our anxiety, right? When we talk about anxiety sensitivity, it's a huge piece of OCD. We've had Karen Winston and others on who've talked about this and or have studied this a lot. What we know is that old school habituation model has kind of been thrown out the window, in the sense that we don't want to send the message that, okay, when we do an exposure, we're supposed to just wait till we feel better. Because then what we're telling ourselves is that we shouldn't move on, or we're not capable of doing other things if we still feel uncomfortable. Where actually the inhibitory learning model and the model that we really push is the opposite, is that you actually feel contaminated, you can feel uncomfortable and still move on. And so, right, it makes sense that you're going to struggle after an exposure, right? You're doing something different. OCD wants you to wash, wants you to clean. And so it's anxiety provoking not to at first. But what we want to do is we want to actually welcome the feelings of discomfort and the intrusive thoughts. So like, oh man, I'm really wanting to wash and I'm feeling guilty that I'm going to cross-contaminate everything now that I've done this, exposure, but going to choose to do that anyways and not solve it and figure it out. I'm just going to contaminate everything, right? It's really about leaning in and doing that. We are going to feel uncomfortable, but you guys, when we actually lean all the way in, you will get so much more freedom than if you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, or you're kind of doing an exposure, but you're not totally leaning in and accepting it. So I'm going to give a quick example, and sorry if this is a repeat, but I always love the trash can example. Have I given this too much, Chris?
No, I don't think so, because nothing jumped in my head right away.
This example for me really helps us understand the model of ERP a little bit. And it kind of shocks us because sometimes we're like, oh, wait, what? ERP is not supposed to feel that bad, actually. So if I have OCD around throwing something away and I'm triggered that what if I threw something valuable away, or what if I accidentally threw something away that I need or that I needed, or threw something away that has important info, right? Whatever, but that's my trigger. We can all agree the exposure is to throw stuff away. And the response prevention is to not check the trash, right? If that was my ritual, I would often go through and check the trash. And so I've done great ERP if I throw something away and I don't check the trash. But if I bag that trash bag up and I walk to my garage and I put it in the garage, and I'm setting that trash bag in the garage because I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm going to put it here just in case I need to check later to make sure I didn't throw it away. Or I'm going to put it here just in case something goes missing and I need to make sure it's not in there. That exposure is going to suck. And what I mean by that is that individual is going to tell me that actually, even though I did the exposure list and I put it in the garage, throughout the day, that fear around what if I threw something away kept popping up. And it's like, well, yeah, it kept popping up because you were still giving your OCD a chance that if it's bad enough, I can still go ritualize. I'm still giving a ritual an opportunity, right? That if I really need to do this ritual, it will be a possibility. But instead, if I bag that trash bag up and I walk to the curb and I put it in the can and the trash man comes because it's Thursday and he hauls the trash off, even though that's so much more triggering or anxiety provoking in that moment, as soon as that trash man drives off, what do you think most people say, Chris?
Nothing I can do.
You're not going to go to the landfill and find your
No.
trash, right? Like, good luck.
You're done. It's over.
People say that, like, man, wow, that was so much more triggering. Like, it was actually easier than keeping it in the garage, which felt easier in the moment because there was nothing I could do. I had leaned all the way in. And so there was not a way for me to undo my exposure and to go ritualize to make myself feel better. Because if there was something valuable, it's gone anyway, right? I can't go do it. I've really, and so my point of this example, that is how we want you to approach ERP in everything you do. I want you to approach contamination ERP that, like, you're contaminating everything, and that no matter what you do, no matter if you go shower or hand wash, it's still not going to undo the contamination. I want you to just make everything contaminated. Because if we live in that and we're fully leaning in and living into exposures that, like, we're not giving ourselves a chance to fix them or undo them later, they actually will be so much easier. You will get freedom so much quicker. But when you're white knuckling of, like, I'll do this, but I'm just going to hold on, and, like, I'm still thinking about it, I'm still triggered about it, and I might just go ritualize later, or, like, I'm going to do this contamination exposure, but I'm going to actually track everything I've touched, and if I really need to later, I'm going to go wash it all, clean it all. More times than not, we end up washing and cleaning it all. Because OCD, we're giving OCD a chance to keep being there and to keep popping up, and eventually we give into it. And because we don't feel like we have a choice. And so we actually want to give OCD the opposite. We don't want to give OCD a choice. We don't want to give our rituals a choice that we can ritualize later. We just want to lean all the way in. So when we talk about doing exposures and leaning all the way in, that's what we're talking about.
They can't see it, but every time you bang on your table or whatever, it's like boom, boom, boom. You know what? All I wanted to add, because you were extremely thorough and that was really good visual. And you're right. I mean, once the trash can is taken away, you can't. I mean, look, at my worst, I might have driven down there, but please don't drive down to a dumpster. But most of us, we won't, right? You're kind of done. What I wanted to say is Dr. Aurelius asked the same, it's funny, because the exact same question pretty much at 12:32, and they asked about how to get past fears of cross-contamination. One thing that you want to recognize, the only thing I'll add to what Liz is saying, is look out for those sneaky compulsions. And I have, OCD and contamination, cross-contamination. Please make sure you are not doing like a mental check of like, okay, that touched this, so now I can't sit on that couch. And then I bumped this, so I can't go over here. And you can't track. And people don't always realize that's a compulsion. Because think about it. The best way to think if something's a compulsion or not is, do your friends and family who don't have OCD do that? No, they don't sit there and have a mental tracking of like, I bumped this, I touched this, can't sit here, can't lay there, can't do this. So if you're noticing yourself as you're doing ERP, also kind of tag in the back of your mind, okay, this bumped this, etc. Make sure you're not doing that checking ritual, because that's going to be pretty bad. Real quick, Terracotta followed up at 12:31 your time, Amanda, and she agreed that there isn't really a core fear, that it's more of a just doesn't feel right. So I'm glad we answered that correctly. But one point that she made that I want us to touch on for half a second is rhyming has lasted more than 5 hours. It gets addictive. I talk to my clients about momentum. If you are in the habit of nipping in the bud compulsions right out the gate, that's your momentum. You just don't really find it pleasing to spend hours upon hours upon hours. But if you start to give in to compulsions, it becomes highly addictive. Your brain is rewarding you for quote unquote keeping you safe. So Terracotta, that's one thing to remind yourself of as you're doing the ERP, is if you get into the habit of giving in for a little bit, it starts to become really, really addictive. And that's why people can spend hours cleaning, hours praying, hours making lists. So if we can nip that in the bud early on, we won't get into that momentum.
That's right. Next, we have so many questions. I love that y'all are posting these. We just don't know how to get through all of them. We know how to get through all of them. It's just by answering them and me talking less. Which one do you want to go to next, Chris? Let's go to, we're going to skip. There's some questions about ICBT. we've done some ERP, lots of different ERP webinars, so I'll encourage you to watch those. And we did an amazing one about kind of like evidence-based treatment 101 with Dr. Abramowitz. I would recommend you watching that to learn more about what our stances are. But overall, at this point, Chris and I really endorse ERP as the most effective OCD treatment because it's what to date has been shown and researched. We do see patients either through our clinic or ourselves. So for those of you asking, feel free to reach out to our clinics in different ways. Next question. This is a really important one. It's at 11:24. My obsession has caused me to mix everything up, and now I don't remember what I really liked and whether my interests were due to obsessions or not. And so I get this where individuals will say to me like, well, I don't even know, is this a preference or is this my OCD? And then it'll be like, well, once I've treated OCD, what do I even like anymore? And like, what is me versus was my OCD? And so how do people help redefine who they are and better understand themselves after OCD?
Yeah, no, this is actually I always plug the conference, but this is the talk that Liz, myself, and a therapist, Michelle Massey, submitted. But this is such a great question, Moonchild, because I think that OCD impacts us in ways that we don't recognize. I do believe, obviously, we all recognize in the way that it affects us with subtypes. But one thing that happens, especially for those of us that started struggling with OCD as a young child, is we start to kind of make choices and life decisions based on our OCD. So not traveling because of fear of contamination or a plane crashing or going through security and, being accused of something, right? Not having people over at your house because they might touch your things, changing your religion because you were getting too many intrusive thoughts as a Christian. People will make these like life-altering decisions. And as you go through the treatment, which is awesome, obviously the treatment is amazing. One thing that you want to be working on with your clinician, especially after the treatment concludes, is figuring out who are you. So I know for me, when I left treatment, I was so lost. I thought I would be like, jumping around, backflipping down the streets, but I was actually really depressed because, like your question, Moonchild, I'd spent so much of my life basing my decisions all on OCD. And so that was part of my discovery process. And so one thing that helped me is start to kind of reconnect with things that mattered. I got a dog, tennis, martial arts, got a job, went back to school, etc. But that is an exploratory process. So remind yourself, though, most of the decisions made from an OCD source are always panicked, quick. It's always because of like the loudness in your head. It's always urgent. It's quick. It's to get your anxiety down. It's to make you feel safe. It's avoidance of feeling discomfort. Those are not things that are based in your personality. I have clients that are like, I'm an extrovert, but I'm starting to feel like an introvert because I overthink everything I say because I don't want to say a slur or something bad. So now I just don't go out. I don't raise my hand in class, etc. That person is making those decisions out of panic. There is no pleasure in that decision. There's nothing that is aligned with who they are. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're making decisions out of panic or fear, if that's the motive behind a decision, that isn't you. That's why we as clinicians have you separate yourself from the disorder, sometimes name it, draw it, talk to it like it's an other. But while you're doing your treatment, especially after, really work on reconnecting with friends, with family, with things that matter to you. And you'll know when you make a decision out of true kind of pleasure. It's just everything about it just feels right versus, whew, I just dodged a bullet.
That's right, 100%. Next question that we are going to jump to is if my loved ones wash the dish and I feel horrible, it needs to be, and if my loved ones wash a dish and I feel like it needs to be washed again, I feel horrible if they catch me rewash it because I feel like they think it's something personal against them. This is a really good question because I don't know, Chris, like if you dealt with this a lot during your battle, I know I did, of feeling like so many of my family members took my OCD contamination stuff personally, and I would have to explain like it's not personal. But now from an outside perspective lens, when I'm like zoomed more out and I'm not as much in it, I get why it felt very personal, right? And it felt like they were contaminated or they were triggered. And actually, this is something I experienced a couple months ago. I was on a trip with my husband, and something had become with our family, and something had become contaminated, and my daughter had been laying on it, and I was like, now the kids feel contaminated. I'm super triggered. And my husband's automatic response was like, what did you just say? Our children are contaminated? Oh my gosh. And he started panicking, and I was like, whoa. And I had to like calm him down, and I had to say, Matt, like, it's okay. Like, I'm just telling you how I felt in that moment, but like, I will work through this trigger. We're not going to do anything. And like, it's actually a good thing, because if people become contaminated, I'm not going to avoid my kids, right? I'm still going to hug them and kiss them. And so now we're all contaminated anyways. We'll just be in it together. And it was actually like, what I was saying is I was embracing it like the trash of like, well, everything's already contaminated anyway, so I have to face this. But for him, it was very concerning of like, oh my gosh, you're saying our children are contaminated. How are they ever going to manage that in life if they find that out? And I was like, what? So tell me, like, I want to hear your thoughts on just how you manage that and how you help explain it and understand it. Again, I do want to be clear though, Got Zero, that the goal eventually is that we're not washing after, right? We don't want to create where we're like, we don't want to engage in rituals all the time. We want to be able to give that up and lean in, but in the moment, or if you're not there yet, or you're not at that place in treatment, how do you address this?
Yeah, it is a good point. I don't even think we've discussed this before. It is something that a lot of lovers, family and loved ones and caregivers I was like combining three words, you know, right? It's something that a lot of people that care for an individual with OCD experience. They feel, you know, I don't understand. I've already cleaned it, or sometimes not even contamination. You know, I've had it with clients where it's scrupulosity. It's where the person with OCD will say, "No, we got to pray again. You didn't do it right." And the person without OCD, the spouse is like, "I'm a Christian too. I know how to pray. Stop questioning my faith." Right? So one of the things that I always believe is educating those around you, especially those who are most impacted about OCD. So how do we do that? Because that sounds great on paper. What I always say is the first thing you want to think about is what is the medium that they intake their information from. So if your family member, who's feeling like it's personal, if they're a big podcast listener, have them listen to a podcast on OCD. There's some great like OCD stories. There's also Your Anxiety Toolkit. You can always show them, if they're more of a visual person, you could show them any of our live streams or any of the community conversations with Ethan and Katie. If they're more of an article reader, you might want them to get the IOCDF's newsletter or go into the IOCDF's website. So you want to find a way that they really intake information, and you want to present that to them. Now, if you have a clinician, the best thing, better than any of that, would be to bring them in and have it explained and let them know that, hey, sometimes coming from you, it doesn't click, but coming from a professional or a resource saying, look, this has nothing to do with you. The expectations the OCD has around cleanliness outweighs anything a normal human can do. And that's why you see your loved one spending a elongated period of time cleaning. So you would only be able to make your loved one happy if you did their same ritualistic cleaning. And that's the very opposite that we want you to do. So you just want your loved one to learn that it's not about them personally, and you want to find a way for them to get it. You may have already explained it and they still dismiss that. That's why sometimes getting an outside resource, depending on what type of way they learn, is most important.
Totally. Next question is, I have a question. Newly diagnosed since November with OCD is so sneaky. So before, my love language was affirmations. However, it has since been determined that it's more of my OCD being tricky with OCD reassurance. If this is my love language, how can this still be used without feeling OCD? I love this question because I got this question in family therapy yesterday where I was able to say something. I said something along the lines of like, I don't want us to think that not engaging in reassurance means we can't be supportive. And sometimes a lot of us feel that way of like, and even clinicians will say like, oh, you just can't answer anything that might be reassurance. And we'll find the family starts to be super rigid around even like, I love you, or giving hugs, or like being supportive. And that's not at all what treatment should look like. So talk a little bit about this, Chris.
Yeah, so what it sounds like is, for you, Jordan, the way that you felt support from loved ones, right? When she's saying her love language was affirmations, it's probably you giving them and sometimes receiving them, right? But now, being newly diagnosed and going to treatment, you're finding out that some of it might be OCD, and either seeking reassurance or like confessing and things like that. What Liz just said is so, so key. What I tell family members, please don't just start dropping any kind of support. And Jordan, don't feel like you have to drop any support for others as well. And it might be looked at as like, oh, I'm confessing, right? What we talked about at the event that I spoke at is the difference between talking to your loved ones about the experience versus content. So for instance, when I would get in the car after treatment, and I'd be really shooken up, obviously, because I'm undoing all the compulsive behaviors I've done for a while. One thing that my mom and I made sure to do, so that it wasn't the OCD kind of seeking out reassurance, was I would talk about the experience. I would say, look, like I'm feeling really worked up right now. I know deep down this is the right thing. And I know by the time we get home, because it was a 2-hour drive from treatment, I know I'll have calmed down and I'll see the value in this. But right now I'm just shooken up. I need some air. I don't want to listen to your country music. Please, God, can we listen to something I like? Like I just needed to be like in a space where I was validated and my emotions were supported. And typically just being heard, I noticed my overall stress kind of dropped, and then I was able to really process what my therapist and I were aiming to do. So what you can do, Jordan, is making sure that your loved ones are still giving you affirmations, but they're not content, right? So if you're kicking butt in treatment, they don't have to sit there and say, oh, well, I'm glad that you're recognizing that there's no way you can get contaminated because these 6 articles I found, right? Instead, what they can say is like, wow, Jordan, I'm starting to notice that you're cutting out compulsions, you're happier, you're more likely to engage in things, you're doing the work. So reminding them that they can still support you, they can still be your biggest cheerleaders and still root you on. It doesn't need to be specific answers. So be honest with yourself and ask the motive. Am I trying to get affirmations because I want my anxiety to go down or to get some clarity? Or is it genuinely because I want them to root for me overall? And that's not going to be as dangerous as reassurance seeking. Oh, you're muted.
Hate that. Love you guys. Your comments, y'all are so encouraging of each other. Just talking about being mentally strong and don't pay attention to your thoughts. Question at 11:48 my time from Soliel. Which OCD subtype would be the fear of ingesting, getting something inside your body? For example, the fear of ingesting a piece of wood, plastic, or glass.
Yeah, I mean, something like that, it doesn't have like necessarily its own category in the sense of like there's I think sometimes I'll hear my clients kind of make up subtypes. They'll say like, oh, I have ingesting OCD. And I'm like, what's that? But what this sounds like is, obviously I have to talk to you a little bit more, but it sounds like a form of harm OCD, because remember, a harm OCD is not always about harming others. It's also about harm happening to you. It might be that you're feeling the over responsibility of being on top of things to make sure that you're being constantly scouting for things and making sure that you're not making any careless mistakes, or you might hurt yourself. Sometimes people's harm is more like, I think I'll deliberately do this because I don't like my life, etc. I think sometimes subtypes are just a way of kind of helping you express to others in the community, like, oh, my OCD is around harm happening to me specifically through ingestion. So I think the bigger thing would be, okay, you have this subtype, right? Like you're afraid of harm happening to you specifically by ingesting something, I'm guessing carelessly, right? Like, so scanning and looking and making sure that you don't accidentally like breathe in too deeply, or you're not near a construction site, etc. So the bigger thing, what I would say is like, that's how the OCD is getting you, right? It gets all of us in a different way. And when we look at a core fear, typically when somebody has a core fear like this, the fear is that you're not on top of it, you're not being responsible enough. Therefore, you're going to be impacted by this, and it's going to cause harm, severe harm, and hospitalization or death. And OCD says, look, Solio, your lifestyle has to be adjusted so you can keep yourself protected from this. What I promise you is all those extra steps you're taking to be quote unquote safer is not keeping you any safer. All it's doing is really consuming your time. So I hope that you're working with a clinician, and one thing that you're doing is starting to identify all the behaviors you either overdo or avoid doing, and start to do some response prevention so your life isn't completely controlled by this at all.
Definitely. Let's go to the last question for today. It is from at 11:32. I have contamination OCD, particularly around chemicals and heavy metals. What's the best way to get past these fears of cross contamination while doing ERP?
Yeah, we answer that question, but one thing I can add is like one thing that I teach clients in the psychoeducation phase. This is not something that I talk to clients with at every session, but I hope this helps people with contamination. When people come in, one thing I notice with contamination is they truly, truly believe that things can just be spread. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be with a client 3 months later still explaining that things can't spread in the way that they believe. But I know for me personally, when I was at my worst, I genuinely believed that I could spread things forever. So what I've asked clients is I've said, okay, I'm going to give you this much blue paint and I want you to paint all of my walls. And they'll look at me crazy and say, Chris, that's not enough blue paint to spread all over your walls. But what I'll say is whatever you feel like you contaminated yourself with. So let's say you're spraying a little bug spray and got a little bit on your fingers and you're doing it somewhere you can't wash your hands properly. clients will feel like they could touch things for 17 years and still spread that chemical. And I'm like, but if the chemical is this small, how did it spread all over? But when I give them the blue paint analogy, they'll say, you're right, you can't spread like that forever. The second thing I talk to clients in the psychoeducation phase is the idea of and then. Clients will say, well, my mom sprayed the chemical and then the wind blew it and then it got on my sister's pant leg and then my sister stepped into my car and then I reached down and touched my car and then I went home and I touched my pillow and now my pillow has contamination. Once again, I will put a little bit of soap suds in my client's hand during the psychoeducation phase. And I'm like, I want you to touch 15 things and get it all over. After the first or second touch, there's pretty much no more soap suds being spread. So I'll explain to them that and then thing doesn't happen for people without OCD, that contamination that goes on forever, that's only an OCD thing. After the first and then, the contamination's pretty much gone. We just proved that together. So once again, these aren't things that I talk to clients at the 18th, 19th, 10th, session, et cetera. But it's just to let you know that your brain has invented a way that things spread that others don't. That's why during the pandemic, people weren't getting the pandemic because they were touching items at a grocery store. That's how come we kept grocery stores open. So part of this treatment is teaching yourself through behavior that the way that you conceptualize cross-contamination is actually incorrect. And that's how the OCD is getting you.
That's right. And I think the big piece here again is, what is your values that this fear has taken you away from? So what are things that you're avoiding that if you didn't have OCD, you wouldn't be avoiding? What are things you used to be able to do that you're no longer doing? That's what we want to get you back to, and we want to be able to engage in triggers or exposures that we're willing to do, you're willing to do. We're not asking you to do dangerous things, but we're asking you to do valuable things. And that's really important. So it is our time, 11:57. Thank y'all so much for your incredible questions, incredible commentary along the way. As always, please go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to be able to submit questions, learn about our upcoming live streams, and of course, to continue to engage with us. Next week will be our research roundtable. So Chris and I will be out, but we'll be back in 2 weeks, which we'll be so excited to come back and continue answering questions. For those of you we didn't get to, we're so sorry, but we hope that y'all found today educational, resourceful, and hopefully helpful and supportive, because that is our goal. It's so good to see you all. We love you guys and can't wait to see you in a couple of weeks. Chris?
Yeah, no, what I'll just say quickly is, first of all, Solil, I'm glad that was helpful. And yes, it does have a name. And I think it's important sometimes to have names for what we're going through so we don't feel like we're alone. Troy, great question about mental rituals. So what I want to tell everybody is one thing that we do, or at least I do it after our streams, any questions we didn't get to, I copy them onto a document that Liz and I have. So one of the things that we do periodically is we record them and then put them up on YouTube. Or what we'll do specifically at the beginning before the questions roll in is we'll read some of those questions. So Troy and others, if you felt like your question wasn't answered, I promise you that we will get to them. Some of you may not know, but this is being streamed on multiple sites. So sometimes if you're on Facebook and you're like, but my question was like 2 down from the question they just answered, we're getting it from YouTube, from Twitch, from LinkedIn. So we're trying to get as many as we can. But I promise that we'll copy those. Or like Liz said, we're here pretty much 3 to 4 Wednesdays of the month, depending on the month. So come back another Wednesday, ask your question, we'll get to it. Or like I said, we'll get it from the questions on live stream. The only thing I want to add is don't forget this weekend is a very cool conference for kids and families, from kids 18 and under and their parents. It's the OCD Kids Camp. So make sure if you head over to the IOCDF website, iocdf.org/conferences, the first conference shown there is the kids conference. Make sure you come out. I know we have about 80 high school registered because I'm helping with the high school kids. So there's a lot of people registered, and your loved one will be able to meet other people with OCD. And as Liz and I can say, meeting other people with OCD is glorious. So make sure to head out to that. And there's a hoarding conference coming up in March, so register for that as well. Thank you so much. Come back next Wednesday for a research roundtable. And in 2 weeks, Liz and I will be back. Thanks so much. And everybody take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.